Welcome, everyone, and good day to all of you who are joining us on this very interesting topic of the eradication of forced labor and supply chains. Thank you for joining us. I'm Brian Lowry of the U.S. Council for International Business, an association affiliated with Business.OECD, the International Chamber of Commerce, the International Organization of Employers, and the United Nations, where we represent the trade and investment interests of our 300 members. It's my pleasure to moderate this panel on forced labor today, and I welcome our distinguished panelists. First, from the French Treasury, we have Romain Champ. He's the Deputy Assistant Secretary Trade, Investment, Fight Against Financial Crime. We then have Gemma Briley, Global Director of Sustainable Sourcing and Human Rights at Danone, followed by Desiree Leclerc, Proskauer Employment and Labor Law Assistant Professor at Cornell University's School of Industrial and Labor Relations, and finally, Evan Smith, the co-founder and chief executive of Altana. What I'd like to do before we jump into the panel is just do a little bit of scene setting for our guests today. Forced labor has been a reality for centuries. It has gone on with government support, it has gone on without government support, and we have tried for years, for hundreds of years, to eradicate forced labor around the world. But it continues to be a reality. It continues to be a challenge and a problem, and for business in particular, as globalization has taken supply chains around the world. And whether we're talking about child labor in Indian cotton fields, or state-sponsored labor in China, fisheries, Rana Plaza and garments, soccer balls, it just goes on and on. Yet we continue this fight to eradicate it. And it's the right fight to have. Let's make no mistake about that. It is absolutely the right fight to have. And I hope today, with these panelists, we can come to understand what works. What can we actually do about this? How can business overcome the challenges of forced labor and global trade and in their supply chains? And more importantly, can business really ensure a supply chain that is free of forced labor? There's been lots of work on this and lots of efforts thus far, but we want to get down to the practical. What can really be done that will really help address this? So Roman, I'd like to start with you. I'd like to ask you, as a government person and the representative on our panel, how can trade policy and national and regional laws positively impact forced labor in global supply chains? Roman, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Brian, for the question. And actually, before diving into how trade policy can tackle forced labor, let me just say that I think it's already a very strong and positive signal that we are able to say today that trade policy has to tackle forced labor, because it does demonstrate that there is some collective agreement on the fact that trade policy cannot be designed in itself, in its corner. Now, when we want to do trade, we have to factor in all the global challenges we have to face together, whether it is climate change, environment, biodiversity, and in the present situation, tackling forced labor. So now that we know that we have to do that, how do we articulate trade policy and tackling forced labor? Well, I see two main courses of action. The first one is domestic regulation, whether it is at national level or, in our case, European level. And the idea is that because of the complexity of today's value chain, the fact that all our companies are so interlinked together, the way our companies are going to behave on our market, of course, has influence on the way other companies behave. Just to give you a number, for example, if you look at EU exports, we have basically 24 million of jobs outside of the EU, which depend on the export we are making as EU countries. So it does show that the way those 24 million jobs are going to be shaped depend on the way our company behave in their export. So the idea is that one of our main responsibilities is to make sure that we mitigate all the spillover effect, the negative spillover effect or trade can have when it comes to sustainable development, and in particular when it comes to fighting forced labor. So that is exactly the purpose, for example, of the regulation we have in France since 2017, the Corporate Duty of Vigilance Law, and this is also exactly the point of the regulation that the Commission put forward in February on corporate due diligence, with the rationale of those two laws being that One, companies have to be aware that they face risks when they are doing business. They have to understand their environment. And the second point is when they are aware of the risks, they have to put in place all the measures, the mitigation measures to prevent or attenuate those risks. So first answer is domestic regulation. The second one is, let's say, standard setting. The idea is, because of market size, because of the values we promote as country, as European Union, and the value we share with a lot of other countries, we can have influence on the rest of the world. And we must make sure to use that influence to promote with allies together higher standards when it comes to sustainable development, and especially when it comes to fighting forced labor. And this is why, for example, since 2011, we have in all our free trade agreements a dedicated trade and sustainable development chapter where both parties in our agreements commit to sticking to a certain set of commitments, and in particular to respecting all the fundamental principles of the International Labour Organization.
Thank you, Roman. I think you've highlighted something here that's quite important that I would just like to emphasize, and that is that you're thinking about trade globally, but you're also addressing how to act locally. And I think that's very, very important as we think about a global trade policy, is what do you do on the ground? How do you make this work? And can these global trade policies and multilateral institutional initiatives really have on-the-ground impact? And Desiree, I'd like to come to you and ask you that question, basically. What is the value and impact of these disclosure laws and regulations? Can they really make a difference? And as you think about that, supply chains have gotten quite complex. You're dealing with people in a supply chain that are 5, 6, 7 layers down from the importer. And how do these laws help importers get at that issue? Desiree, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And before beginning, I'd just like to thank the economists, you, Brian, for moderating, and my fellow panelists for engaging. And as you note, a critical area and a continuous challenge in the global governance of labor standards and corporate compliance. Now, to answer your question, I think the easy or the simple answer is we just don't know yet. One of my colleagues at Cornell, Sarosh Kuravila, just published the results of a study on the impact of disclosure regulations across various corporations. His results are a significant wake-up call. Because of the inconsistency in labor standards, definitions, and processes across a latticework of public and private disclosure rules, there's no consistent system against which to weigh impact. His work suggests that, to the contrary, corporations influence compliance and auditing efforts to, on the one hand, get credit for their transparency and compliance, while on the other, continuing to profit from rights abuses, or at least from not paying a lot of attention to what's going on, as you mentioned, along the 5th, 6th, and 7th chains of production. US is experimenting with different disclosure laws by controlling what goods can cross the border. So for products coming from Xinjiang, for instance, US laws are now imposing a presumption of forced labor unless there's what the CBP is calling a clear and convincing evidence showing that there wasn't forced labor. So those laws rest less on supply chain due diligence, and they place the onus instead on the exporters and importers, which might in turn decide to do business only with those corporations that prove to take their due diligence or disclosure requirements seriously. So it gets to the same intention, but by influencing the demand and consumption rather than the production. Will any of this prove effective? Only time will tell. So I think that we just have to watch this space. And as we discuss further, consider this a laboratory of experiments and weigh the pros and cons of each different approach. Thank you.
Thank you. Very, very interesting, Desiree. Roman, anything to add?
Well, frankly, I fully share the point. In France, like I said, we have a law since 2017, and we are only now starting to see the effects of that law. And we know that other countries in the European Union are also rolling forward regulations right now, and the Commission put forward a regulation a few months ago. So it's really very early to evaluate the impact those regulations will have. So, no, I fully share the point made by Desiree.
Great, thank you. Gemma, coming over to you. I listen to Roman, I listen to Desiree, and I hear in my head compliance. I hear audit. I hear track and trace. We all know there's lots of costs involved in compliance measures. regardless of what discipline. And clearly in the area of forced labor, there are. And help us understand, as someone who's worked in this area, the real costs involved in the eradication of forced labor and proving up, if you will, the absence of forced labor from a supply chain. How does a company budget for that to support its commitment to eradicate forced labor in a real and effective and impactful way? Please go ahead.
Thank you, Brian. No company has limited resources, as we know. So the question about budget is really about the resource allocation. So I can sketch out some really key components in that consideration. First of all, we don't underestimate the value of raising awareness, engagement, and capacity building. And often, forced labor is very much hidden from people's day-to-day. And secondly, we have to hardwire the due diligence approach up and down the organization, from corporate governance and as well as all the way down to how we implement and tools and processes. And a third very important area is how we invest time and resources to forge coalitions and partnership, because we cannot address this issue single-handedly. It's a very systemic issue. And another area I want to also highlight, which is in response to Desiree's comments, that we also need to consider implementing certain sourcing strategies and sourcing practices that do not contribute to the downward pressure on the supply chain. Because, the contribution sometimes is hidden from us, and which can drive malpractices in labor standards. So we need to be very vigilant on that. Obviously, that could have commercial, financial implications. So these are the key components I see in building the budget, allocating resources to tackle forced labor issue.
Thank you very much. And indeed, resources are not unlimited. None of us have an organization that is without limits on its financial resources, its humankind resources, and its opportunity to have time and effort spent on every issue that they encounter. And those limits can be very, very hard to understand when you're trying to plan forward, not knowing what you're going to find. Because as you said, there's so many things that are hidden in the supply chain. You don't know what you're going to find, and then it's going to take more work and more effort and more resources to address those. Evan, maybe coming over to you, maybe share a little bit around that cost. We know there's huge cost to not doing it. We understand what the costs are of not doing it and the continuation of forced labor and the loss of market and the loss of imports, loss of products. But perhaps you could help us understand the real cost of tracing and tracking supply chains. And also, are there any best practices that you would recommend or share?
Yeah, so as I listen to the conversation, I notice a lack of specifics on how to actually get at the problem. Right, so I think it's helpful maybe to start by defining the problem. It is almost never the case that a reputable business is knowingly purchasing from producers of goods using forced labor. That is a very, very small percentage of global economic activity or global supply chain relationships. The issue is, as those tainted goods make their way through the illicit supply chain, the links downstream become obscured. And so as a large buyer or as a consumer or as a regulator, the challenge is, how do we create upstream visibility to and from these forced labor networks, whether it's in Xinjiang, West Africa, Southeast Asia, or wherever it's occurring. So that's fundamentally a problem of visibility. And historically, there has been really a consulting and auditing driven approach to generating visibility, because we've built a globalization over the last 75 years, which is in a lot of ways designed to hide the supply chain, extended supply chain network from us. So we have direct one-to-one relationships between our suppliers and buyers, but we don't have multi-tier visibility and engagement across a supply chain or a value chain network itself. So the fundamental challenge is to reveal that value chain through sub-tier relationships, in many cases all the way back to the soil. So historically, the way that companies and regulators have attempted to get at that problem is through audits and through consulting engagements where humans go and map a supply chain network, or they'll even audit a factory or a field for labor rights violations. And the fundamental challenge there is the expense of that approach. It's a human-driven approach. As you scale to thousands upon thousands of multi-tier relationships, that approach fundamentally can't scale. The second issue is, by definition, those mapping efforts are stale. Or an audit of a factory or a field is a one-time inspection. And so as you consider the global supply chain network and just the inherent fact of this living, breathing global network where all the relationships are changing, the flows of goods going from point A to point B are changing on a dynamic basis, a mapping-based approach just fundamentally isn't up to the task. So what I think then this points to is the need for data and data access and visibility at scale. And so, as you get into business-to-business data, procurement data, import data, government data, the fundamental challenge here is the data sovereignty, the intellectual property concerns, the security and privacy concerns attached to that data. And I think if we're to get at a fundamentally scalable and cost-efficient, Brian, to your question of cost efficiencies here, if we're going to actually get at this problem in a scalable way for the private sector and the public sector to engage on the problem, it has to be a data-driven approach, and it has to be an approach that unlocks global business-to-business and procurement and logistics data at scale.
Great. Thanks for that, Evan. As someone who, in a prior life, managed 40 to 50,000 audits a year in remote agricultural places, I couldn't agree with you more. One visit to a farm is not necessarily going to prove that it is free of child labor or forced labor, because if they know the auditors are coming, they know to keep the children out of the field. And it becomes very, very difficult. I'd like to go back to you, Gemma, and see if you had anything else you wanted to add based on Evan's further elaboration on the ideas that we had raised with you.
Yeah, certainly traceability and visibility of the supply chain is a key challenge for manufacturers such as Danone. We are 5-6 steps away from the producers. But in some categories, for example, our fresh milk, we have very direct relationship with our dairy farmers. On some ingredients such as palm, we built segregated certified palm supply chain in the last few years. That certainly gave us better visibility. However, if I take, say, soy feed for our dairy cows, that's just impossible to trace. So the challenge is absolutely also kind of compounded by, if you think about foodstuff, often go through multi-staged transformation, mixing, merging, in some cases chemically modified. So that's just to add on to the complexity. I do believe in data and technological advancement. We see some solutions such as DNA testing or blockchain. However, these are not, to Evan's point, are not really scalable and also very costly. Increasingly, we also see satellite playing a role, not just for deforestation. There's also a role to play for carbon emission as well as, forced labor. So technological advancement, I see, is a key unlock for us. Also, sitting from the side of a manufacturer, another key unlock is really supplier engagement. If you look at the global trade, there are a few choke points. How do we engage with some key suppliers to unlock? Because ultimately, they have much better visibility to the supply chain, so they can help us to address this challenge.
Great. Thanks, Gemma. Evan, if it's okay with you, I'd like to come back to you because some of the things you highlighted made it very clear that business cannot do this alone. We heard Roman earlier talk about the French plan or the French National Acceleration Strategy, the 15-point action plan of the EU, all of which are laudable events. But business needs help. They cannot do it alone. And how can governments enhance the impact of business actions and provide clarity and predictability for business? How can we better collaborate between business and government?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the right frame. So this is really a sort of prime opportunity and requirement for public-private partnership, and mobilizing both the regulatory capacity of the state and the data availability and the data disclosure authorities of the state to bring an actual collaborative framework to bear with the private sector. So I want to actually focus in on a precedent that I think we can build on. So in most economies now, there is an import concept around what is sometimes called authorized economic operators, or in the US, it's called CTPAT, but it's effectively a trusted trader program. And the premise of these programs is the private sector can voluntarily undergo additional disclosure and auditing to prove to the border agency, in most cases, that it is doing its best from a security and trade compliance standpoint to uphold the highest standards of supply chain compliance and of trade compliance. In exchange for those voluntary efforts and expenditures, they have expedited clearance and reduced friction at the border. So this concept was really born out of 9/11, and it was originally designed around security concerns. So I think the expansion of authorized economic operator programs, or CTPAT in the United States, or trusted trader programs more generally, is the intellectual and sort of regulatory foundation upon which we should build. So if you then apply this in the context of forced labor, what this could mean is you have the regulator saying, if you, the private sector, can demonstrate proactively that you have multi-tier supply chain visibility, that you've exercised reasonable care and diligence in tracing any upstream exposures to forced labor networks, and if you can then further demonstrate that you're taking steps to mitigate any potential exposures, then we're going to reward you by creating a green lane for your goods through the border. And we're going to give you the certainty and the assurance to engage in these million and billion-dollar procurement decisions with confidence, because that's really what's paralyzing the private sector as these laws come into effect. So I think public-private partnership and the expansion of the AEO concept is really the key here, and the unlock for, again, scalability around the premise of data visibility.
Great. Thanks, Evan. Roman, I'd like to come back to you at this point, given Evan's comments and your prior comments about domestic and regional legislation and trade policy on the concept here of public-private partnerships and working with the private sector and helping business and government collaborate to help eradicate forced labor. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Brian. Quite interesting. Well, frankly, I think as governments, we do recognize that the regulations we are putting forward have a cost and raise challenges in terms of implementation. And there is a true willingness from a part to take a share of the burden. And I think we can do that in two ways. The first one, which I think is quite linked to the question of public-private partnership mentioned by Ivan, is question of clarity. I think as government, we have to be as clear and predictable as possible when it comes to what we are asking of business in terms of due diligence. And to give you an example, you mentioned our national acceleration strategy. A whole part of this national strategy, which has been built with our private sector, is dedicated to drafting training material, organizing workshops, drafting guidelines, and trying to bring as much clarity and making sure that companies have at their disposal all the tools they need to implement the regulation and the international standards. And we are doing the work at domestic level, and the European Commission is doing the same at European level, and they drafted a few months ago a whole new guideline on the question of due diligence. So first aspect is really clarity and building something, building trust with the private sector on what we expect as governments. The other aspect is more, let's say, public-to-public cooperation, because what you mentioned is a lot of us want to fight forced labor, and we all have the same objective, but we don't always have the same means to attain this objective. And I think it's quite important that we are able to dialogue to make sure that our businesses are not facing sometimes, let's say, contradictory requests from the governments, or that you have regulations which can be conflicting between countries, but also on a more positive side, that we are able to share experience between governments on what is working, what is not working, how, for example, business in the US doing due diligence, how it works in France, and that we are able to learn from each other. And just to give you one illustration of that, as you know, we have a huge cooperation with the US built on the Trade and Technology Council. There was a meeting in Paris a couple of weeks ago on that in Saclay, and there was a whole track of that meeting dedicated to the question of forced labor and making sure that we can exchange best practices and see how the US do things, how the EU do things, and try to learn from each other.
Great. Thanks, Roman. It's interesting to hear on one level how much we have done as a world and how far we have come and the capacity that we have to actually get after this problem. And yet, Desiree, earlier you said it's early and we're in a bit of an experimental lab here. It's too early to call the race, if you will. I think we all want the same winner, which is the eradication of forced labor writ large. And we see new things coming all the time. For example, the US with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And I'd like to ask you, going a little bit more from the theory to real practice, have you seen really successful supply chain tracing and tracking to get after the problem, not just to issue a report, but to get after the problem? And if you have any examples you could share. And when doing that, I just want to put one more thought on the table that hasn't come up yet, and that is that when tracing supply chains, it occurs to me that the workers' voices are critically important, because it's the workers that you really need to talk to. And where workers have no voice because they're informal people or they're marginalized and at-risk human beings, how can business get after that problem? So Desiree, I know I've loaded it up there for you, but please, your thoughts would be appreciated.
Thanks, Brian. And thanks also for mentioning the critical key of worker voices, which is something that I was going to try to address at some point, because it's interesting. We speak a lot about the ingredients of supply chain due diligence, but we never talk about the most important ingredient of all, which is essentially the ability for workers to be able to feed into this. We bemoan the fact that we don't have data and we don't know how to get to the data, instead of looking at how to strengthen the worker agency that could provide that data in the first place. And I think unless and until all of these efforts begin to center on also allowing workers within supply chains to be able to organize and to be able to speak with one collective voice to countervail against corporate profits, we're going to continue to have these discussions decade after decade, talking about incremental changes in government regulations and corporate compliance. And I don't think that we're going to get very far. Now, you've asked me, I've seen this issue from a number of different lenses. I have worked for the International Labor Organization. I was a negotiator at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. I've worked with businesses for 15 years now in their attempts to be able to better identify tracing efforts. Have I seen what I would consider a successful effort? The answer is a resounding no. As Gemma mentioned, there's new technologies that are being introduced that might eventually help us get there for some products. So she mentioned, there's some really interesting developments with DNA tracing, how you can spray, cotton, and then along the supply chain, test the spray and be able to trace back the DNA to its origins. I've seen, proposals about blockchain technology. So the Department of State had an interesting pilot project with Coca-Cola using blockchain technology to be able to see the origins of workers' work contracts along the supply chain, to be able to see whether or not they had a contract, whether or not the terms and conditions of those contracts proved against suspected exploitation. Those are welcome initiatives. I just haven't seen anything at the tail end that suggests they've really conquered this data gap, particularly because, again, these are innovations that have nothing to do with allowing workers to actually be able to answer the question about what their working conditions are. Some of the products that we're looking at may never lend themselves well to tracing efforts. I've worked for years on illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, otherwise known as IUU fishing, where forced labor and other exploitative labor practices prevail across borders and regions. By the time fish end up in our stores, they've undergone a complex process. Some workers were exploited during the process of catching the bait to catch the fish. Other workers were exploited on the fishing vessels, and so on. Making matters even more complex, fish production isn't always linear, meaning it doesn't go a straight line from the catch to the market. Fish are often processed in common markets before their distribution, rendering it nearly impossible to trace their origins. Because of the financial drivers behind IUU fishing, private initiatives have proven woefully inadequate. Governments have, again, been experimenting with various regulations and law, including state-to-state enforcement, targeted facility enforcement, and import regulations. So, for instance, the United States withdrew trade benefits from Thailand and downgraded Thailand and its annual trafficking in persons report to the lowest possible status a few years ago, which prompted new, albeit imperfect, inspection frameworks in that country. Their efforts, as rights advocates note, like the Human Rights Watch, they note that those efforts don't adequately protect the workers, particularly not migrant workers. Ghost ships make it nearly impossible for governments to identify and trace those vessels within their borders. So in that respect, there is something positive coming out of this. There are some recent governance initiatives that have promise. Trade partners are increasingly joining forces to trace fishing practices across borders. So under the United States-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, for instance, those countries agreed to cooperate on combating forced labor as it crossed their borders. The United States has also submitted a proposal, as many of us know, to the WTO to urge all WTO members to help address and combat the use of forced labor and IUU fishing within the framework of the fisheries negotiations. Now, I know that WTO members tend to balk at the mention of labor. However, hopefully by now, those members have come to realize that IUU fishing hurts their markets and their workers. The prevalence of exploitative fishing practices place them on watch lists, restrict their trade potential, and they cannot identify and trace those inherent cross-border practices on their own. All to say, as governments begin to work more together and not in silos and try to engage in these dialogues more, I see more promise, but nothing concrete as of yet.
Great. Well, thanks, Desiree. Gemma, Desiree raised and responded to the question about workers' voices. As a consumer-facing company with hundreds, if not thousands, of SKUs and numerous brands that are very well regarded and sought, actually actively sought by consumers, what do you hear from consumers about this? Are consumers ever raising this with you? How do you connect with consumers to let them know, yes, maybe our products cost more, but that's because we're taking care of small farmers in a remote village, or we're helping subsistence farmers produce ingredients that we need, or we're managing palm sourcing responsibly. I'd really like to hear your thoughts on how you connect with consumers and make the case to consumers that this is the right thing to do.
Yeah, we see many really positive changes in the consumers' awareness and responses to the social issue. Traditionally, consumers link sustainability to environmental issues. In the last few years, increasingly, our consumers are demanding to know more about people behind the food. I would still say it's a very small minority, but I think this minority is growing. Of course, that push companies to really start to focus on, addressing all kinds of, decent work, labor conditions, all these really thorny challenges in our supply chain. So we connect with the suppliers through our brands, and we increasingly see the awareness in the social issues.
Great, thank you. We only have a couple of minutes left, and what I'd like to do is I'd like to give each of you a word, or in Roman's position, 2 words, and I'd like to have your reactions, whatever you have off the top of your head, in the context of eradicating forced labor from global supply chains. So, Evan, I'll start with you. The word is information.
It's a Rorschach's test. So I think the fundamental issue in actually understanding the networks of production is somehow accessing and learning from the data that describes that network of production. And we've sort of accepted as fact over the last several decades that the supply chain is a big, opaque fog into which we cannot actually peer and clear away the fog and understand the network of production. So, like, rejecting the premise, I think, is step one, and then step two is actually articulating both legal and technological solutions that can make that data available. So, what I don't think can or will happen is the notion of like a global data utility where all this data is directly pooled and commingled. Nor do I believe that a global supply chain blockchain is somehow going to solve this problem. And I've spent a lot of time in both supply chain and in supply chain data, and have a lot of conviction around those two premises. So I think there's a new technology that points the way, which is federated learning. So this is really only achievable at scale as of maybe 3-4 years ago. It's actually happening on our cell phones as we speak. And so the concept there is to bring the compute to the data where it lives and not the other way around. So what you're not doing is commingling and storing data in one big central environment, where you have governments and private sector entities pooling data. And instead, what you can do with federated learning is actually meet the data where it is and learn from it. So I think I'll leave everybody with that. I think federated learning is the sort of legal and technological unlock of the problem we're describing here.
Right. Thanks, Evan. And we just have a couple of minutes left, but I want to get through each of you. So I'm just going to ask you to be pretty succinct. Gemma, I'm going to come back to you. Global company, brands all over the world. The word for you is harmonization.
Yes, as you can see, we face, many challenges when it comes to legislation. Some of our transparency disclosure focused, some are really advocating due diligence approach. So the harmonization takes multifacets for us. First of all, harmonize under UNGP, guiding principle for business and human rights, and also harmonize under OECD guidelines. That's first thing to say. And secondly, harmonize due diligence approach across environmental and social issues. The siloed approach is going to really detrimental. Sustainability involves trade-offs. And the third harmonization is about definition, data sharing, data gathering, etc., across multiple markets. So harmonization for me.
Great, thanks, Gemma. Roman, I've got one that I think you'll be comfortable with. Forced labor is a financial crime. So let's hear your thoughts on what comes to mind when you think of forced labor in this context. In financial crime.
Well, yes, it is. It is, Brian. You're right. And well, frankly, financial crime is another one of those global challenges we have had to fight for decades, and everyone wants to fight it. And frankly, when I look at the kind of results we have achieved in the field of financial crime, we have international standards set by the Financial Action Task Force. Almost every country in the world committed to respecting them. We have a peer review process, which is quite thorough. At the end of the day, we also have a name and shame process, which does get results in raising the bar of the way we all implement or financial crime regulation. Well, I think it can be quite a good source of inspiration of the kind of results we can achieve and aim at now that we are all committed to fighting forced labor.
Great, thank you. And Desiree, for you, enforcement as a former USTR negotiator.
Former USTR and former ILO. So it's a mixture of government enforcement and rights advocacy. So right now we're witnessing, as we've been discussing, a global experiment in enforcement. These efforts are promising because, like in any experiment, some laboratories will prove more effective than others, allowing us to chart a more deliberative path forward. However, and as we just discussed, none of these experiments right now center on strengthening worker voice and agency. Neither do they seek to foster an environment capable of enabling workers to organize and countervail against corporate interests and profits. As a result, we notice that we have big gaps in data. We're lacking the data about labor because we're not asking the laborers, or what we keep referring to as data, themselves. We need to dramatically shift our mindset. Recall that we are dealing with people, not with data, and shift our resources to helping those vulnerable workers, not just monitoring them. I'd like to conclude by noting that these innovative approaches to combating forced labor through private-public measures are welcome. However, governments and corporations along the supply chain need to recognize that unless and until those enforcement efforts include giving workers the right to speak collectively, their enforcement measures will be inadequate to protect those workers from the exploitative practices carried out in the supply chain shadows. Thank you.
Thanks, Desiree, and thanks to the whole panel. We are out of time, but I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. I hope our audience got as much out of it as I did, and I hope that we can stay in touch and continue this dialogue as we all join together to address this critical issue to respecting the human rights of people around the world. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.